agitating and waiting.
Agitate and wait.
Wait, agitate.
As opposed to agitate, wait in a different context, which
Yeah.
means something different.
Yeah.
But these guys agitate and wait, as opposed to the other idiots who agitate and wait.
I don't know. So I don't know how whether I don't know whether I approve. That's what I mean.
Well, do we? A good thing we don't need to stamp our seal of approval.
Don't have to decide whether we approve.
I have
or not.
started
Yeah.
recording. I
Yeah,
noticed that you weren't looking at the screen, and I was like, "Hit record."
Sneaky. Well, I mean, I've said everything that I have to say. So hopefully you got it all.
Yeah. Now we'll just talk about Warhammer for the next hour. Yeah. Sorry, guys. First episode back. Dan, we're back. We weren't really gone. We got a very nice message on Twitter from a listener who was like, "Hey, hope you guys haven't gone anywhere." And I was like, "Oh yeah, God, we haven't recorded an episode in a really long time."
I haven't said anything.
Folks.
We've just disappeared.
Yeah, I think the last episode we said something like, "We might go away for a week in a little while, maybe after the next episode." We just didn't record anything for a month. What are you gonna do? Do we owe them an explanation? The explanation is just we're busy. Shit going on.
Yeah.
This
Jack and I are both sick, so
exactly. This is when Dan and I usually plan on getting sick. So yeah. I had a whole joke planned out where I was gonna pretend that you and I had some massive falling out over a minor difference of interpretation of the falling rate of profit. But I was like, it feels a little bit too real for Marxist podcasts. I didn't even want to look at Dan because of how he thought about the TSSI. God damn it. Anyways.
Yeah, I never really see those things happen in real time, but there are people that I used to listen to who have now fallen out or whatever, and just how did that happen?
It's either that or somebody goes full anti-woke, and it's the Patreon check is due. I see. Interesting.
Yeah, imagine that if we just disappear and then a month later the podcast is rebranded and with something. I don't know what we would be. What would we be?
All these goddamn snowflakes.
Yeah. Well, we talked. Yeah. I don't think we could do right-wing politics. We contemplated being Warhammer 40,000 killed or something.
What did you call it? What originally? Auxiliary statements? Oh, that was very clever. Very clever. The temptation's there.
My joke. Oh yeah.
The temptation's there. Yeah. When we inevitably reach the nihilist communist end game of Marxist podcasters, we won't go anywhere. We'll just start talking about new orc models. And that'll be it. Yeah. That's our promise to you.
Yeah. And neither of us have had time to do any warhammering. Have any thoughts? Exactly. I don't know if you have any thoughts. But...
I have no thoughts. I have my half-completed Warcry team sat here, which one day we will play some games with. But what are you gonna do? Anyway, listener doesn't want to hear about this. Unless they do, in which case we should just keep talking about it. But they definitely don't. I'm sick. Dan said, it was the first thing we said when we came on the call. It was I'm sick at the exact same time. So get ready for a lot of mutes and then coughs. That's exactly what that was.
Strategic mute.
That almost worked. That joke almost worked. It worked for me because I could see what you were doing. Very funny. Very clever.
It was not very nice. It was pretty gross.
Well, we're both sick. What are you going to do? It's not COVID though.
We
got that going for us. I found a old crusty ass COVID test in the back of my medicine cupboard.
Never again, Jack. Never again.
I'd forgotten how to do it. I was like, is this really how you do it? That's disgusting. Anyway, it's not COVID. So you can't get COVID from listening to this. Unless you have the microchip. Okay.
Unless
Dan.
you're listening on your 4G phone.
Yeah. Oh dear. There's been so much going on in the world since we've been had our podcast hiatus, but it's so grim that it's just there's no reason for us to talk about it. Go listen to something else. You all know how grim it is. And that's about that. We're going to talk about the only thing that matters, Dan, which is councilist left communist politics from before World War One, which is really
that's
fast
becoming our safe space.
Definitely is my safe space. As I've said before, like reading this stuff is just like slipping into a warm bath. I love it. I love these debates. It's all so good. I read this a month ago and then completely forgot about it. So again, apologies if I'm like, what was this about? If I completely missed
it a few hours ago and then
okay, we'll see what strategy was better.
Yeah.
This is from an old councilist, maybe left communist journal. Let us know if you guys know anything about this, called Radical Chains. It's the second issue. It's from 1990. It's by a fellow named Bob Shepard, and it's called Anton Pannekoek and the Theory of the Transition. Our last episode, we spoke about Pannekoek and psychoanalysis, I believe. And we were like, Anton Pannekoek, tell us more. Because he's been somebody we've only engaged with peripherally for this podcast. And whenever he comes up, we're just like, oh, love it. So good. He obviously came up in State and Revolution when we read that recently, right at the very end, where Lenin is like, Pannekoek, despite his like childish tendencies, was correct about this. And we were like, oh, okay. Again, more reason to go read Anton Pannekoek. And this is kind of like, I guess, a defense of Anton Pannekoek. Maybe like defense isn't even the right word. It's more of a like, remember this guy? He certainly seems, prevalent to this debate going on 25 years ago. Yeah, exactly. And it's basically trying to defend him against maybe like more orthodox, quote unquote, like Leninist, more orthodox social democracy views, trying to bring those back. And kind of trying to remind people why that all went wrong and how maybe it was all kind of baked in the cake from the very beginning. My first note is this starts off as a diatribe against Pantheon building before immediately Pantheon building, which I thought was very funny. the author's like, how dare you have like, pictures of Lenin on your wall?
It's like Pantheons are bad, but Pantheons are bad only because you haven't included Anton Pannekoek.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's actually almost
this is what I was thinking when you were saying, like, it's not a defense against people who criticize Anton Pannekoek. It's like designed to tell people why they should love or hate Anton Pannekoek. Like,
exactly.
However you come away from this, you should feel something. That's all that he wants you to do.
Viscerally, you should viscerally feel something. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was from my like cold flu-addled brain trying to remember from a month ago. I did wind up really enjoying this because it's a critique of social democracy and specifically of the SPD, which I think is something that even if like a lot of Marxists now don't wind up agreeing with it, you need to be kind of whacked over the head with it a little bit just to kind of keep you on your toes. I think I kind of honestly wound up agreeing with almost everything that was said here regarding criticism.
Or this particular version of left communism, the Pannekoek Council communism, you should
be aware of. I guess that. Just like the critique of a generally like attempting to be a bit more materialist about, well, who is this party actually representing? Why did it actually fall apart? Why did it not work? Why did they wind up sending in the Freikorps to like go slaughter all of the people in the various communes and in the various Soviets, right? And yeah, it's really trying to get away from essentially what is like a liberal understanding of history, which is just like bad people were in charge and they made bad decisions. It's like, that's not true. And yeah, I don't know. I appreciated it. What do you think?
Oh yeah, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, you're right to highlight that portion of this narrative that's critical of the SPD. Obviously, we're in an age where there's quite a lot of excitement on the left, if somewhat critical, like a critical reappraisal of party building along the lines of sort of like the SPD model, or sort of like looking rosily upon that era. And Pannekoek's analysis, as presented in this essay, is very much a critical assessment of that as being almost continual downward spiral toward the ultimate betrayal. Like, everybody recognizes the betrayal of, well, I suppose if you're some kind of Leninist or Marxist-Leninist, you recognize the betrayal of 1914 and the sort of either signing for or abstaining on the vote on for the raising of German war credits and the sort of acquiescing to the Second World War. You recognize that as being sort of the betrayal of social democracy. But there were critical voices before this time. I mean, we know about some of them. The guy who wrote this obviously highlights Rosa Luxemburg as being somebody that's sort of like peripheral too, but still somewhat included in the traditional pantheon. There are points in this where he pairs Pannekoek up with Rosa Luxemburg as sort of like being the main critical voices in that sort of left social democratic space. But yeah, Pannekoek presented here has I guess, a familiar critique of social democracy, but one which it was good to be reminded of. And also there were quite a lot of new things in it, particularly the author's discussion of the essential connection in some ways between what the SPD became and the space from which it emerged, which is in this legacy of the extraordinary laws in Germany which made the SPD illegal, and sort of like the Bismarckian state that they emerged out of, and how that sort of went on to fashion their eventual form and their approach to politics, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is basically a story about the SPD in which Pannekoek's critique is used to kind of like help mold a narrative in that story. I think it's really hard for people now to imagine what the SPD was back then, because it was just such a dominating influence over everybody's lives in, the new country, which was Germany, right? But the thing to kind of remember is that we look back and we look at how many people were part of that party and how many, how much power it wielded and how it controlled various governments and all of this stuff. And we go, wow, people who were like quoting Marx, talking, who are actually like controlling things in the government. You do really have to look materially about like, or maybe not materially, but like systematically, like the function of a system is what it does. And if you really start to actually look at who they represented and why the party form was structured in the ways that it was, and you look at the history behind that, you really start to get a different picture, as opposed to just like, this is the thing that's going to lead us to Marxist revolution, right? And you spoke about the exceptional law, which kind of outlawed all this revolutionary activity, and then how eventually the German state allowed for electoral activity, and they allowed the SPD to eventually, work out in the open. But again, I think what you really have to remember is that there was like a long succession of German conservative politicians who engineered not just the unification of Germany and the creation of a German state, but also its like mass industrial ascendance to a world power, like really trying to compete with England, really trying to compete with France and all these other powers, right? A rising United States, right? And the SPD really helped them do that, right? And this is what the author here is really trying to point out, is that the SPD was kind of unfortunately a tool that was used for like mass amounts of good, right? It was used for mass amounts of worker suffrage. It was used to really give workers a voice. It like really helped up living standards, wages, all of these different things. But it was also a tool. I have a quote in here somewhere that I wrote down. Yeah, the author says that the Social Democrats did what the officers of the German government could not do, namely quiet the unruly masses and accustom them to discipline, right? So it accustomed them to put forward their demands, however radical they were, in a language that was understandable and controllable, kind of to a certain extent, by the German ruling classes. People always talk about how Otto von Bismarck was one of the craftiest politicians of all time. And I really think he must have been, because like to have this mindset to go in and go, don't just like, throw everybody in prison who wants any kind of reforms, like actually, legalize certain aspects of what they're doing and use it towards like an industrialization and progressive, building of the German state. This is like genius. And when you form it like that, it's a bit more unfortunate, the history of the SPD, because it isn't, let's just do that again. It's like, well, why would that be allowed? What would that actually accomplish?
Yeah. I mean, I know limited amounts about this period of history, but it seems to me that a process of transformation of, well, even not even the process of transformation of the German state, but like the inauguration of the modern German state in something analogous to its current borders at the beginning of the 1870s, represents far more than any other bourgeois revolution of that era. It represents a very conscious and deliberate and really accelerated process of building a modern bourgeois state in the period of 40 years or something, and or less. And I suppose what's interesting about the narrative of this essay is it adds into that story the place of the workers' movement in that, as not being inherently opposed to, or as not necessarily being like a counterforce to the German bourgeoisie and the German bourgeois state apparatus, but rather as being an essential element to that, and one which allows for the development of modern capitalist conditions in Germany. Yeah, and I guess there's some ways in which, like, you could, to use the language of like later left communists, like what the SPD did in some ways, whilst being this sort of like radical in some ways radical, or right, like radical in the sense that it represented the working class as a force, a potential social force in and of itself. What it also did was represent the working class as the working class. It didn't challenge that class role necessarily. In some respects, it did what the workers' movement of old always did, which was champion the role of the working class. And if, as some left communists say, that the role of the working class is class abolition, then that the sort of like institutions of social democracy of that era were really not geared or minded toward class abolition. They were minded toward the affirmation of the class in some respects.
Yeah, this is something that's really well said, because that made me think of something that we read in Endnotes 5. Something we read in Endnotes, curse statement. The Emmy O'Brien piece on the abolition of the family, which was phenomenal. One of the better things, like, at least in my opinion, that we've read for the show. And her whole point in that, right, is that like Marx and Engels, specifically Engels, like they were progressive for their times, but like still quite regressive in the idea of family abolition, because the whole idea for them of family abolition was like, creating a workers' movement so that the workers could have families like the bourgeoisie, which is like, now we know that that's like, like, oh, a nuclear family, how progressive. Thanks a lot, guys. And it's a similar thing that's going on here, right? It's like the whole affirmation thing. This is Endnote's bread and butter, right? Yeah. And the other thing that I think I always champion when I talk about the SPD, and this made me think kind of twice about it, was this idea of like creating an organization that you could live, as the author says, from the cradle to the grave in, right? Where it's like, it's this mass organization. We're always talking about how great would it be if you could go back to having like workers hiking clubs, workers gym hours, workers dance clubs, everything like that, right? SPD, all of these different things. Because the SPD back in the day did have all of these things, right? It had pension schemes, women and youth organizations, holiday groups. That doesn't sound fun. And unions, really importantly too, right? Like the unions were all co-opted, not all, but like mainly co-opted into this electoral machine that again translated all of this anger and resentment over the massive industrial changes that were going on in Germany into something that the bourgeoisie, the ruling classes, could understand. Yeah, it's just something that made me think twice, because that is the thing that I'm always like, criticism of the SPD aside, how great was it that socialists could get together and do these things? And here they were like, criticism of the SPD aside, how bad was it that socialists could get along and do these things? It's interesting,
Yeah, and like in some ways it's the thing that's most exciting about the SPD model in some respects is what it represents is the ability is the working class building organizations where it can take on responsibility for managing its own affairs separately from the apparatuses of the bourgeois state. I suppose it's kind of like a counterpower or an alternate power structure. But there is a sort of parallel reading of that scenario where they're not sort of like fashioning counterpower. They're just building their own institutions to sit alongside or fulfill the functions of broader sort of bourgeois state apparatuses. And I suppose like what they create in some respects is perhaps like the what would become the sort of like Western social democratic welfare state, right? Like, but before it's acceptable for those functions to be taken on by the state, they create them separately, or they create the political forces which move them from being counterpower forces to being something which could be state functions. I'm speaking
that's really interesting.
Very hypothetically now. I don't really know if that's the actual good historical analysis.
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about it like that. All I will say, my current thoughts on social democracy, I went camping in Norway last week. This is one of the reasons we weren't around. And a Guinness in central Oslo cost me £10, Dan. So that's what social democracy gets. Yeah. Socialism, Dan, it never works. What are you going to do? Yeah. And this kind of gets into the crux, though, of the author's argument here, which is a much more materialist one than you generally hear about the SPD, I think, which is that as around this time, international competition was growing, right? And it was getting harder and harder for Germany, even as it was industrializing, to keep up, right? To keep up with, lowering costs, all of these different things, as imperialism was really starting to kick into gear, all of these different things. And so you started to actually have fewer and fewer skilled craftspeople who could make a living, right? And the author makes the point that it was these skilled craftsmen and women who basically made up the bulk of the SPD. And so as you started to get like this rising international competition, all of these different things, rising industrialization, this kind of led to the rise in Germany of the unskilled worker. And the unskilled worker was just kind of who you think of generally when you think about workers around these times, right? It's like factory workers, people like that, condition of the working class in England kind of types, right? But the author also makes the point that these people were much more radical in their demands and they were much more militant, right? These were the people who were actually kind of not willing to do business with and to communicate with not just the ruling class and with their bosses, but also with the unions. And you started to get a rise in wildcat strikes. You started to get a rise in much more militant working class activity as this de-skilling kind of happened. And it was becoming more and more apparent that not only could the ruling class not control these people, but the SPD couldn't control them either. Because at that point, like I said, the function of a system is what it does. The SPD was controlling this working class resentment, mainly by representing, if this piece is to be believed, skilled craftspeople, right? But as this de-skilling happened and this more militant, unruly, unwashed, unbathed masses started to like rear their ugly heads, the SPD couldn't control them. Because, it was in the SPD's interest to maintain trade union discipline, right? If there's a wildcat strike happening, they don't want to discredit themselves by proving to the, ruling class government that they can't control the workers. They want to get it crushed and they will just go accept the ruling class's demand. But at a certain point, something had to give, right? And I mean, this is the cracks that would eventually lead to, the biggest disaster of the 20th century in the rise of fascism. But this is really early days that we're talking about. So it was a very long, slow process. I think this is what I took the most from in this essay.
Yeah, and what's kind of interesting about that is, although we could imagine the outbreak of the First World War as being the thing that ultimately fractured the sort of mainstream of European social democracy, with two things that this essay describes. One is the like ultimate reluctance of anybody within the SPD to split the SPD, despite the fact that there were extreme differences developing between the various wings of the party, all the way through from like the most reformist right-wing elements to the most sort of like radical Anton Pannekoek types. And although it was like the process of the First World War and the revolutions that resulted that sort of like ultimately fractured social democracy, the schisms that were actually became apparent were this history of the SPD's failure to actually represent the most radical elements of the working class, who were engaged in wildcat strikes that the SPD were trying to put down or refusing to support, and ultimately represented a much more like spontaneous sort of grassroots working class politics, which didn't really have representation in the mainstream of the SPD, I guess.
And I guess in that era, it kind of reflects like our time now, right? Because it's like it's since COVID, really, you're starting to see, it's kind of died down again now, but you're starting to see like actual wildcat strikes like Amazon, right? And you're starting to see, I don't know, service industry, sectors of the service industry that were never unionized before, really trying to like get unionized, really trying to kind of push back against the kind of, I don't know, I guess post-World War II status quo, if I can even go back that far. And it's interesting, people do try to equate the DSA in America with trying to build something like the SPD because, and their reasoning is sound, right? It's like, work with what we have. This is the largest ostensibly left-wing organization in the country. We need to, establish hegemony in that, build a mass party, blah, 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 blah. But I think what this essay has kind of made me think is it's like, well, who is the DSA currently with its membership base? Even when it was at its peak, who is it actually representing? This is just purely, what's the word? Begins with an A. Purely based off of my own experience, anecdotal. This is purely anecdotal. The DSA meetings that I went to before I moved out here, not representative of the broader working class, not representative of the most radical of the workers. I think we can all kind of guess who those people are, DSA types. I would just, all I'm saying is that like, you would have to question why it is that even the Labor Party, like who are these people representing materially? Why is it that Corbyn was able to have the limited success that he had? Why is it Bernie was able to have something approaching minor success, not quite, that he had? And where is that coming from? And kind of pretending that it's coming from somewhere that it's not. I don't know. I don't have answers for like what to actually do, but we're Marxists. All we do is criticize things anyway and not come up with solutions. So there you go.
I mean, it feels like in a modern context, we're more at a stage where, under modern circumstances, we're grappling with the collapse of the workers' movement, or we're living in conditions long after the high water mark and well into the collapse of the traditional workers' movement. And so you have a series of trade unions who are so primarily like sectoral and trade-based trade unions who represent very specific skills, very specific sets of workers, and in some respects in some cases willing to take radical action. But I guess it's not analogous to this early 20th century scenario whereby the representatives of workers were failing to stand up for them, kind of thing, but rather that this new workforce, the sort of precarious gig workforce in Amazon factories or whatever, in Amazon distribution centers or what have you, don't even have a natural representation. And so I guess there's a new space that they're obviously butting up against much stronger forces. They're butting up against like state and sort of private forces that are not used to dealing with or competing with trade unions or workers' representation of any kind in these spaces. But I don't know. Maybe it's
well. Also, I think you're right, and also
in the sense that like
also like a collapse of anything resembling a welfare state too, right? So there's absolutely the space that you're talking about opening up where there is no representation in this kind of like gig working economy, precarious worker economy, right? But then there's also a space opening up in that the space where the state was traditionally supposed to step in and look after, whether it's, a surplus worker population or, workers who are sick or workers who require extra help, or even just like the basics of social reproduction, right? They're not, and they haven't been for the last 50 years, and it's only been getting slower and worse, right? So, yeah, grim. But what does Anton Pannekoek say, Dan? What does Anton Pannekoek say about all of this? I suppose we should actually get to him.
Geist.
Do you want to talk about Geist? Should we talk about?
I don't know whether I feel particularly well able, but
you said Geist in the beginning. You said this was Hegelian.
Hegelian
is fascinating. You're an expert on Deetskin.
It felt very Hegelian to me. That's what I will say. But I mean, this is in the same way that I'll speak with a dubious degree of confidence around ideas of the dialectic,
Of course.
Yeah. Treat me with extreme suspicion when I say things like this, Jack, please. But no, maybe we should try and talk about the philosophy of this a little bit. I'm not sure I understand it fully. I don't really know very much about this guy, Joseph. What's his name? Deetskin, who was very influential on Marx, apparently, as the kind of the philosopher of the workers' movement, or what have you, I guess. And he was very important to Pannekoek. There's something in this essay where it suggested that Deetskin for Pannekoek is kind of introducing scientific thinking and processes into the practice of philosophy in the same way that maybe Marx did for history. A lot of what this essay is about is detailing, it's in the title, isn't it? Anton Pannekoek's theory of the transition. And a lot of what's influencing Pannekoek is a philosophy which is applying to ideas of consciousness and the process of radicalizing the proletariat and what that requires, and this dual process of both the sort of development of material, political, technological conditions, but also attendant with that a historical development of working class consciousness that comes along with that. He has a very sort of historically informed approach to knowledge, and so he's suggesting that certain historical, philosophical ideas become possible with a certain historical materialist development of history and social forces, and what's more, the more somewhat of a sort of classical Marxist take, but the more progressive social classes, the proletariat in this instance, are uniquely positioned to take on new forms of social analysis. And so he's sort of saying that Marxist and socialist political economy is furnishing a particular class with a certain set of ideas which, because of their class position, are uniquely positioned to take hold of these ideas and wield them for progressive political gain, I guess, to win their victory, I guess.
Yeah, and he also compares. He basically says political economy is to the proletariat as the natural sciences were to the bourgeoisie, right? Which I thought was really interesting. Made me think a lot about actually the Christopher Caldwell.
Yes,
and I was oh wow, I wonder what Christopher Caldwell would have thought about Anton Pannekoek. Maybe not particularly highly, because I think he was just a Leninist. I could be wrong about that.
I mean, they were writing around the same time, weren't they? I think,
or
a little bit later in the 20s. So
he's a scientist guy. They're both scientists.
Yeah, they're both scientist guys. They get on.
Do you know if Pannekoek and the GIC
have never disagreed?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, did Pannekoek and the GIC ever speak?
I don't know.
They must have done. It would have been insane if they didn't. Anyways, someone I'm sure will let us know about that. Yeah, and also he gets from Deetskin this idea of kind of being suspicious of anything resembling an absolute truth, which I thought was really interesting. And I think that he kind of used that philosophy as kind of, in a way that was reminiscent of what we've read of Rosa Luxemburg's critique of the SPD, kind of a it's not quite a necessary but not sufficient in terms of parliamentarianism, but it's a I don't. Pannekoek certainly wasn't fully against the SPD, and he certainly wasn't fully against electoralism, and he wasn't against even reforms. Right, that's fairly obvious. But I think that he just really thought it was impossible to maintain this kind of like electoral trade union discipline in the kind of like face of intense pressure from capital. And I think that he saw which way the winds were blowing, with a rise in imperialism and with a rise in worker exploitation and de-skilling that was going on with this kind of, ever since the unification of Germany, and kind of just, like I said, just thought that it was going to be impossible to actually maintain this discipline. And he probably would also say, to what extent is that actually, why would you even want that? Why would you want to maintain this discipline? You actually want to use this energy because, you can't call yourself like a Marxist or a socialist, which, a Marxist probably loads of people in the SPD wouldn't have done. But you can't call yourself a Marxist and be like, the movement for communism is the real movement that actually exists right now that abolishes the current state of things. It's like quoted at the beginning of like every left communist text ever, right? And then turn around and be like, but you need to actually maintain trade union discipline, and we can't accept wildcat strikes, and we can't do this and we can't do that. Those two things just fly in the face of each other. So to a certain extent, Pannekoek is saying that you do need to rely on the spontaneous energy that is the actual movement for communism. The actual movement for communism isn't the bureaucrats and the SPD. It isn't even the mass party itself. It's the workers, taking things into their own hands. And what I'll say on that too is that I'm not sure why a lot of people would have listened to Pannekoek prior to like 1905-ish, because it really took him a long time to actually figure out what this form was that was going to lead the workers to communism, right? And that was the Soviet, that was the council. And, fascinatingly, like it's mentioned in this that the 1905 revolution wasn't mentioned once in the meeting of the International in, I guess, 1905 or 1906, whenever it would have been. That's stunning. That's like, maybe they were just really racist and they just didn't care about like the Slavs in Eastern Europe. But it's like, that is crazy in hindsight, and just shows you everybody's priorities were at.
Yeah, I mean, in light of what we read of like Rosa Luxemburg's experience of 1905 and what that did for her thinking around strategy, it doesn't necessarily surprise me that like there was just a general incredulity. It as a political experience either had to be transformative to your thinking or probably denied if your strategy didn't fall into line with it, I suppose. I'm sure there is a certain amount of like racism against like the less developed peoples of Europe, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it's also maybe even like the Marxists were like, that letter to, is it the letter to Kollontai, or who is it a letter to? The famous Vera Zazulich, I think.
Yeah.
The one where he's like, well, maybe you can actually do socialism in Russia. Maybe that just hadn't been published yet. We'll cut them some slack. They were just like, you can't have socialism. They need to complete their bourgeois revolution.
Well, they just didn't have the right, like, it's funny in this how the author talks about, well, it's an interesting effect, like Pannekoek not really quoting from Marx very often. He sort of paraphrases Marx, but doesn't quote from him. It sort of comes back to this like, critique of the sort of scholasticism or the pantheon building of traditional social democracy and traditional and what became like Marxist Leninism, whatever. The point that I'm making is they hadn't incorporated the Marxist letters to Vera Zazulich into the pantheon yet.
If your bibliography isn't a certain number of references long, why would I even read your paper? Although it's so funny though, because like I really have enjoyed the way that Pannekoek has written and what we've read of him, just because like it goes against this kind of like who can quote Marx the best scholasticism, because you can quote Marx and misconstrue him like anybody else, you know what I mean? Just completely take him out of context. Obviously, everybody does that. But Pannekoek, and it's weird because Pannekoek's like the only actual scientist in this era who's actually talking about this stuff. You know what I mean? Maybe that's just it. Maybe he just understood political economy as much more of a development of ideas as opposed to a like Marx got it right and that's it. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, he's got a positive. What's the opposite to a degenerated research program? A positive
regenerated.
Regenerated. He's got like a positive proposal. I say that it is the classic like left communist, council communist wait and see, because I suppose an interesting thing to highlight, I guess, is the thing. What he's saying is there needs to be a certain development in the consciousness of the working class, and that's going to be brought about by historical events and historical experience. And there is for him a certain place for propagandizing and agitation, and you can reflect the conditions of the workers back at them through working class and party propaganda, but you cannot influence their thinking through agitation in a way that's fundamental to or sufficient to bring about revolution. There's a sort of contrast drawn between Lenin, who thought you could just like take the workers as they are and inject certain ideas into their head, and hey presto, you'll be able to have a revolution. And Anton Pannekoek's approach is very much not that. As a sort of, I don't think it's a quote from Pannekoek, although it's the author paraphrasing Pannekoek, saying that no, there's absolutely no possibility for a party to make a revolution. Revolutions can't be made in that way.
I wonder though. I wonder if it's a bit more complicated what he's saying than that, because he isn't denying. He's not coming out and being like, "There's no role for the party, so just get out there and try to build councils, dude," like you get with a lot of councilists. He is saying that there's a role for a party, and I actually think that maybe he's defining it in something that would be a bit more familiar to us, at least in terms of like cybernetics and systems theory. Because there's the classic stuff that everyone who's come after him in terms of left communists latch onto, which is the like amplification and explanation of circumstances, which is what you're saying. But he also, when he talks about the role of the party, he says that it needs to do two things. It needs to connect actions, separate actions that result via the workers as a result of the class struggle, connect them together to give them a sense of their own relations, right? So you think about something like the George Floyd protests and Amazon wildcat strikes. I don't know how you'd actually try and connect those, but you'd maybe some sort of education program or something, or you would actually try and get people who are involved in both in each other's program or something like that, right? And then he also says that you need to, and this is something that comes directly via systems theory, is that you need to have some sort of structural autonomy. This is really reminiscent of when Beer talks about how a theory of autonomy doesn't come from political action or political theory. It comes from systems theory, because managers can never actually manage the amount of variety necessary to manage everything properly. So you need to just allow for autonomy. Although weirdly enough, it is actually coming from political theory here. It's coming directly out of political theory. They're just coming to the exact same conclusions, which I kind of think is funny. But it's interesting. And because like most people who quote Pannekoek and most people who like come after Pannekoek, especially the like endnotes kind of theory communists, like all of that stuff, who are not really like the arch understanders of a lot of like at least maybe more councilist political economy, but at least their politics, they definitely understand. And there's a bit of a line there. I think like there is an understanding that there needs to be something like a party here, because like going all the way back to even before Pannekoek like understood the form of the Soviet or the Workers' Council, like he was saying something along the lines of, like we said, about like necessary but not sufficient for the party. It's just that the party needs to be structured in a way that maximizes autonomy, and basically being a tool of the German bourgeoisie is not it. And I think he would probably say also making your main aim like electoralism is certainly not it. And so I don't know what that would actually mean in terms of having a main aim, if it would mean not having a main aim, if it would just be a loose confederation of peoples. This just sounds more like anarchism if that's what it is. But I do think it was more nuanced than I was expecting, and I appreciated it, because you don't get a lot of that in a lot of left communist stuff,
Yeah, I really appreciate that synthesis of this and systems theory. I hadn't really incorporated those ideas together, so that's really fascinating. Yeah, maybe it's just a more well, in this piece, there's a suggestion that like the SPD and other social democratic parties represented something somewhat close to Marx's understanding of what a political of what the proletarian party would look like, but was not quite there, and maybe that force that you've just described as sort of like that linking of working class social elements together, that sort of organic structuring of a social force is much more analogous to Marx's conception of a political party than maybe Kautsky's one.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, certainly there's much more of an emphasis on international politics, I suppose, just insofar as it doesn't fit with, the specific interests of one nation, I guess, with what Pannekoek's saying. There's also another thing that's really interesting about all of this is the kind of, okay, you said the word Hegelian. Now I'm going to say the word dialectical. There's an interesting dialectical connection that Pannekoek paints between the relationship between consciousness and change, material change. And, he basically says you can't, this goes back to what you were saying. He's saying that material forces in and of themselves are probably not sufficient to bring about a communist revolution. You need an actively communist proletariat, which is funny because, like, when you think about like councilist left communist stuff, you kind of think all about the material changes. Well, man, that's just going to happen. It's what it's going to be. But Pannekoek puts a lot of emphasis on agitation and organizing in a slightly different way. Well, in a different way, I should say, to the SPD and to social democrats and stuff like that. But he's also paints it in this really interesting way where he's saying that the consciousness, the rising level of class consciousness among the workers should affect the party, just as the party should affect the consciousness of the workers. Again, that would be, how you're supposed to model for that, I think is a really interesting question. But that's kind of got to be it. Because like if you don't have a like dynamic party form, it doesn't matter what you're focusing on. It's going to immediately become reactionary, right? It's like there's a quote of Marx's that's something along the lines of there are 1,000 sects all the time, but then as soon as there's like a time of revolution, they're immediately all reactionary, right? So, you have to be able to be dynamic in that way. And it's a dialectical synthesis of these two things where one is influencing the other. Yeah, that was quite good. Well done,
yeah, it's kind of the classic example of a organization ossifying in its purpose and meaning kind of thing, getting stuck in particular tactical or strategic forms, being incorporated into the system in some way. And it's the diversity and creativity of like the smallest elements in a system that can keep it like evolving and developing and remaining functional to its aim, or sort of like revivifying its aim if necessary. And like he's clearly championing that process kind of thing, and that force behind it.
Yeah. Again, it's an interesting thing on how you would want to model for that and how you even could model for that. I guess that's just why people fall back on like build the mass party.
Well, yeah. I don't know. I'm curious to know what you mean by model for in that context, because was sort of what I was thinking before when I was sort of making allusion to the conversation we had with Viv a few weeks ago about what is it to do Marxist science, is Pannekoek engaged in a scientific research program, I guess. Like he's making certain predictions, but in some ways, like how do you? And I suppose, as you've just said, like there is an engagement with party and activism and agitation. It's not the sort of crude quietism that I initially painted it as. But when you say model, like in some ways that this sort of spontaneity of the working class can't be prepared for or mapped necessarily, but maybe I'm misunderstanding what you mean.
No, yeah, I think you're definitely right. I just think like how could you have an organization that could respond to as many potentialities as possible, right? It's like, who knows when they're going to burn down a police precinct in Minneapolis? Who knows when they're going to have a wildcat strike? But how can you have an organization that doesn't attempt to like assert control over that movement, but to give it tools necessary to my brain has just stopped working. Succeed is the word that I'm looking for. Which again, I'm not sure how possible that even is, but I think it's just a matter of maximizing your chances, right? Maximizing potentiality, modeling for variety. There you go.
Yeah.
That's the term.
There is a term. I suppose there is that raises the question of like when should an organization split? You know, like
the real question.
What we want is the systems theory analysis of the splitting of sects. You know,
I did make a note in this that said, this note I made is during stagnation you either focus on differences or points of agreement, but I don't remember which one Pannekoek suggested you do. No. And I didn't write it down. So, the answer was right there. Darn it.
Oh well, we couldn't possibly go back and look.
yeah, forget that. Yeah, what was this? Like 17 pages? No way. Come on. Well, okay. I mean, the last question, as happens whenever we read something vaguely left communist, the question is how relevant, I guess, is this to today? Obviously, you were speaking about the change in material circumstances, which is the decline and fall of the workers' movement, and in anything that would be remotely familiar to kind of just like us, but also to like Pannekoek and to Lenin and to Luxemburg and to all of these people, right? Are workers as spontaneous today as Pannekoek clearly sees them to be in the time that he's writing? I mean, obviously, in the last episode, we spoke about the end of all of this, which is fascism, and now Pannekoek was like, we need to attempt to explain this. And also, to what extent does the form that Pannekoek is writing about privileging, which is the council, at a certain point in his, scientific career or whatever, to what extent is that possible now in a like mass globalized economy? Questions to ponder.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard for me to say, taking the first one of those, it's hard for me to say with this limited reading, it feels like Pannekoek is saying there's going to be like a constantly progressive evolution of consciousness, and therefore a consciously building or a progressively building conscious battling between the forces of the proletariat and the sort of like bureaucratizing, system stabilizing reimposition of capitalism, reimposition or introduction of counter-revolutionary processes, kind of thing. Like, now I'm not sure whether Pannekoek's vision is like a constantly growing level of consciousness, because that's clearly been set back to some degree. But I guess like maybe there's just a degree to which the consciousness that's capable in members of the proletariat is appropriate to the material conditions they're surrounded by, and then we sort of just have to look at, okay, what are the mechanical and the systemic systems of control and transmission of ideas? What is people's experience of living in this social system? How do they engage the social relations of capitalism? How are they reproduced? Because, when I was alluding to this being Hegelian, like the thing to say is this is very much like you have material forces and then they create consciousness and ideas in people. So there's no sort of like idealism necessarily, but like I guess in that sense there is a question of look at the material forces, and then look to the consciousness that sort of results from that, I suppose. I mean, councils is probably a tactical thing which emerges from a particular set of conditions, and so to simply be championing councils now, are sort of like over 100 years since their sort of high watermark and institutionalization into the Russian Revolution, is probably incorrect. But as you were saying before, like finding organizational forms which can represent as much as possible the diverse variety of the working class, which can be built into creating a diverse, representative political movement and political party. Like, what are the potential mechanisms for that? I don't know. Is it something like a council or what? I don't know.
So what you're saying is the commune, Dan. The commune.
The
that's
commune
the new
state.
Left
Yeah, that's what
thing.
we do. We just do the commune state.
Do the communes, which have been popping up, frequently. There's one in
Wincheap, one my street next over. Yeah.
That was really well said. Very, very well said.
Refuse to be in their commune, though. I'm going to form my own commune.
Fuck that commune. Yeah, my commune's splitting.
Yeah.
I think very well said, and I think you're absolutely right to basically champion the council now, when there hasn't been a hint of a council in a very long time, would be to make the exact same mistake that Pannekoek is saying don't do. And this was 100 years ago. Obviously, things have changed. Pannekoek would expect things to have changed. The issue now is that, like, there is class consciousness. That's the thing about our days, Dan. People get it. People get that they're being screwed. People talk about capitalism all the time. Obviously, when in a Marxist framework, when you talk about class consciousness, it's a much more material factor as opposed to like an ideological one. It's one where they're doing the thing you want them to do, which is why it's such a tricky kind of phrase to talk about. Class consciousness tends to be when the workers are doing what I want them to do, which is fighting for communism. I don't know. There is plenty of class consciousness going on right now. It's just that there is this, like, I don't know. You, I'm sure, have this exact same experience. Whenever I try and talk with anybody about politics, they go, yeah, it makes all sense if I'm talking about Marxist shit. And they go, well, then what? And I just go, the age-old question. And then what? Exactly. And this is why people fall back on voting for the Labour Party, voting for the Democrats, whatever. Because there are no councils, there are no communes. There are just random wildcat strikes where you try and get the boot off your neck for a little bit and you try and save our NHS. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I don't know. It's tricky. It's kind of calling that phrase into question insofar as it not just being something ideological, because as material force, consciousness is escaping our grasp right now. So what are you going to do? But hey,
I'm becoming increasingly unconscious. I don't know.
Yeah, no kidding. Me too.
I think from reading this, what it would seem to me that Pannekoek would say is that we should use the scientific apparatus of Marxist political economy to fashion a strategy and a sort of set of ideas which we can propagandize at people, and if it conforms with their level of consciousness, their understanding, their experience of the world, then it will be taken up, and if not, then we should I don't know, try again.
Yeah. Hey, dust ourselves off, try again, man. Yeah. I mean, again, this is just the age-old thing. And again, I talk about people falling back on liberalism, talk about people falling back on something like social democracy. It's like, if our ecology wasn't the most important thing on our minds, it certainly should be, because, the whole ticking clock nature of that before everything just gets thrown into chaos, again, kind of throws this method of strategizing into chaos a little bit. I don't know. This has all been said a million times, but things are complicated. Things are very complicated. And I've said this before, if anybody says they figured it out, they're definitely trying to sell you something. So, what are you going to do? What were you talking about? Patreons at the beginning of the episode? Right back to that.
By the way, we've got some new merch.
Yeah, new merch. Oh my God. Auxiliary statements merch.
Latest auxiliary statements merch drop.
That's so cursed. Oh my God. That would make me so uncomfortable.
Yes. Jokes.
Yeah. Walking around to like B&Q, you see some like plain kid, like auxiliary statement shirt. Oh my God. Yeah. I think some people were legitimately like, was there a split in the podcast? Which I think is so funny. Also, that was like the first break you and I have ever had from the podcast, because usually around September we like bank podcasts. Didn't do that this year. We just couldn't be fucked. We were too busy. This was like the first break we've actually had, which would have been good if we weren't so busy.
If we'd have been having a rest.
Yeah, exactly. Anything remotely coming close to a rest.
Yeah. And some of the most intense weeks of my life.
Yeah, exactly.
In various ways, in good ways and bad. Not bad, but like, it's just life. Life is happening.
Life. Life is certainly happening. Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, we're back.
Yeah, exactly. I went away for a week and now I'm moving countries. So that's what happens. As it happens when you don't podcast. What I will say, feels good to podcast again. Dan, get back in the podcaster's chair, my creaky ass chair. This is nice. It's very nice.
Right.
All right.
Well, we better stop and work out what we're going to do next week.
Oh my God. Yeah, exactly. God, that's right. We have to do this again. Oh my God. All right. Well, Dan, this was very fun. Thank you. A very enlightening conversation. I feel like this is actually a conversation, not that they aren't always like this, but I feel like I've actually, this is going to come out very wrong. I've actually learned something from us talking this week, just because I think that we my brain's dead. You know what I mean? I learned something from what you said.
We both weren't sure, and we made ourselves a bit more sure. Exactly.
Right. All right. Well, here's to a couple more of those. Thank you, Dan. I will talk with you soon. Right now.
Bye, Jack.
Hey, everybody. Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.